Welcome to the SEI podcast series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Hello, my name is Suzanne Miller. I'm a principal researcher here at the SEI in the Agile and Government team. And I'm here today to interview Ann Connell, who is a cybersecurity engineer over in our CERT division. Today we're going to talk about business email compromise in all of its many forms. And I'm excited about that because I get crazy business emails, and I know we do a lot at the SEI to try to defend that, but we want to find out more. So before we get into that topic, just tell us a little bit about how did you get into this kind of work? What is it about? What is it that you do here, and how did you get to the SEI?
So I started off working in the CMU School of Design. Really, I worked there for about 10 years as the network manager. And a lot of the faculty, especially because they tended to be older, and phishing isn't something that just came about. It's been around for quite a while. That was the first taste of seeing people get taken, responding, malware on their computers, and or just, for them it was everything related back to the virus that, CERT famously discovered and dealt with the
Morris worm.
So I'm not saying it was the Morris worm, but it was indeed a lot of them getting phished. And it's interesting, I'll never forget the one faculty member, I won't use his name, but he said, I got an email and they told me that I had money in this Swedish bank account. I had to ask, do you have a Swedish bank account? Did you ever open one? No. I said, well, then it's probably a scam. Yeah. And to them, it really was, why would people even do this, right? So I was pursuing my degree while working there, my master's degree in human-computer interaction. And while there, just wanted to actually use it more so than just, managing computers and setting up machines. So I took a job here at the SEI, working for what was the team before Step Forward on creating training for the SEI and then and for all its customers. And shortly after that, there was something, it was the group headed by Rich Nolan. It was the Digital Intelligence and Investigations Directorate. And working with them, they had a lot of law enforcement, federal law enforcement liaisons. And initially, I was working on the projects, kind of creating, web apps for them to access tools and training. But then it became much more interesting to work with them on requirements gathering for these tools. Yeah. And in doing the requirements gathering, you really got to see the problems that they were dealing with. And that's sort of my path into this work now.
Okay. So let's talk about business email compromise. We've had everything from the historical Nigerian prince that I think everybody in the world has seen at this point, up to more recently something like Operation WireWire, which was a scam that involved like $14 million in fraud. So really big numbers. So this is something that's been around a while, hasn't gone away. So we need to deal with it. Yep. And your work is doing that. So tell us a little bit about what are the types of business email compromise that we can be looking for, and especially what are the ones that are more insidious?
So I'm really glad you said the Nigerian prince, because we've come a long way from the Nigerian prince to, in fact, the Operation WireWire and that Nigerian criminal ring, again, Nigerian. We've come a long way, but there's a lot of things that are the same. So the attack vectors that I want to talk about are there's the CEO scam, and they're all scams, by the way. Right. It's just business email compromise is really just a fancy way of saying sophisticated scam. So it's CEO, CIO, good old social engineering, and or brute force, lawyer impersonation, and then we also have the romance kind of scam, developing the relationship over time. The CEO scam, that's when a relationship is built a little over time where they get in on the network. In this case, the company, they infiltrated the network buying credentials on the dark web. And then basically just kept trying, right? Because they could have 100 attacks that they're launching. Only one needs to succeed.
Right.
Then they jump around the network. They obtain domain admin access, and then they can find out, how the email servers work, whether it's digital signatures or the signature just on an email. Right. And then indeed they can see who works for who, and basically find the best way to target someone who might work for that CEO and be able to impersonate them. So the instance here, the one that I talked about first before Operation Wire Wire, was the Texas Energy Company scheme. And that was a young man by the name of, who went by Colvis. That Texas Energy Company, he selected it simply because there was a direct flight from Lagos, Nigeria to Houston, Texas. Wow. So we'll come back to that eventually, because I think it's really interesting that his criteria for conducting this was based on a direct flight. And it was easier to go to Houston and more cost effective for him than to fly all the way to San Francisco. And essentially, he was already working with pre-established money mule groups. So that had a lot to do with the areas in which he was interested in. So he selected this energy company and pretended to be the CEO, sending an email about 3 o'clock on a Friday, pretending to be the CEO, sending it to the person who would process the wire transfers, sending it, that wire or in an email, directing them to do it today before close, and that he would be unavailable this weekend. In fact, they social engineered his Facebook page to find out that he was the coach of his daughter's soccer team, and even that she was going to have a game on Sunday, so don't contact me. Right. I mean, really extensive work into finding out the best way to make this convincing.
Yeah.
And even in the signature, he included, the same terminology that typically their vendors would use in their invoices. And it really was a convincing story and communication that turned out to be then a wire transfer of $3.2 million outside of the company to a fraudulent account. Yeah. That particular case, now that's we're talking 2013, 2014. Colvis wasn't his first name, it was his middle name. And they were able to find him because it happened to be his Instagram handle.
Oh, okay.
So the same way in which he was using social engineering to find more information about his target to make his scam more convincing, they used social engineering to find him. This is just a really interesting fact. He had already applied to go to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County to study architecture. And he actually had come in, I'm guessing, for the interview. Yeah. They tried to intercept him that time, but the supervisory special agent in charge of the investigation just happened to be out on maternity leave. Oh, okay. So she missed him that first time. But he had applied for a visa, and on his second time in, that's when they were able to intercept him. He stood quiet for quite a while, but they eventually got information from him about the criminal ring that he was working with. So that's a very thorough example of the CEO impersonation. Right. But there's also lawyer impersonation, and that's to intercept, say, huge payoffs for a home loan, or especially when you're buying a home. Sure. You're sending that initial down payment, whether it's 20% that's required. They'll pretend to be the lawyer that's taking care of that transaction. There's also, just regular social engineering, finding out somebody who might be an attractive target. You can even really assess their level of sophistication, their tech savvy, by how they interact with their social media. So
Oh,
There's
okay.
that,
I got you, yeah.
establishing communication with them, pretending to be one of the vendors and reaching out to them. That's how a gentleman in the scam that was Quanta, he was able to get $100 million out of Google, Facebook, by pretending to be that vendor.
Yeah.
And sending fake invoices to these companies, including a wire transfer or wire transfer specific information so that it would go to these fraudulent accounts. So really, tech savvy companies,
Yeah,
we're not just
yeah.
talking about energy companies, we're talking about Google,
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah.
They're falling for it, right? It all depends on who you get to, what level of employee, which is why organizational training and awareness is so important.
Sure.
So there's also romance scams, there's lottery scams, there's theft of your W-2 information and your tax returns. There's a lot that stem.
I actually know somebody who had their tax returns. Their tax return was intercepted.
Yeah.
And they went through all kinds of stuff with the IRS, to get that resolved. And
the work that happens for these victims.
Yeah,
It's regular
it costs
people.
a lot of work and trial
Yeah.
for the victims. I also had another colleague who was a victim of the. I think this would be the social engineering. I'm in London and I lost my passport and I need $1,200 to get home.
Yeah.
And they sent this out. They got his email list and sent it out to a dozen people, and 3 of them sent money. So 3 of his friends sent money to this fraudulent account, but the plausibility, I think, is really the work goes in on their part into making it plausible, because
Yeah.
he is somebody who does travel internationally, and he's a little bit absent-minded professor, so it wasn't.
Oh, they're counting
him
on that.
losing his passport
Yeah.
wasn't something that people would say, "Oh, that would never happen." And so that I think that's the key to a lot of these is building the plausibility. So how do I, as an employee, in a company that interacts with lots of different people, SEI interacts with lots of different people. Now, I don't control money or anything, but how do I protect myself from being compromised by these people that are really good at building these plausible
That's
scenarios?
a really great question, because even we here at the SEI, I'm sure we have tons of network appliances in place to try to prevent these attacks from happening. But all of those appliances, right, are very sophisticated, looking for malware, looking for viruses. You might have 3 firewalls in place, and a lot of this stuff just pings off of that, right? It doesn't even get to us. The difference here is the attack method isn't very sophisticated. It's that our data is out there. And the fact that users are under attack, right? So it's not difficult for somebody to actually have this happen, even somebody here at the SEI. Again, the Google and Facebook stuff. You would think that there'd be more organizational training and awareness, since this is number 5 on Gartner's list of the types of attacks that are the most common attacks and the most devastating. Basically, the IC3, which is the Internet Criminal Complaint Center, they record these incidents, and they're largely underreported because organizations and companies, they don't
want everybody knowing that they got taken.
Right. They don't want to talk about the breach that might have happened.
Sure.
They don't want to talk about how much they got taken. They don't want to. They don't want the hit to their brand.
Yeah.
Because recovering from these things is pretty. It's not just the $3.2 million that goes out the door. It's also then the loss of recovery. The what data do we need to purge?
Right.
How'd they get in? So then there's the remediation of both your network rules and how you train employees, and all of that is pretty disturbing when you think they're still concerned about the loss of productivity at the same time.
Sure.
They don't even want. Maybe we shouldn't train everybody, because we don't want people not doing their work too, right? We don't want to lose 4 hours for every individual. So there's a lot of trade-offs that take place. But my point is, it's a lot more than just the take.
Right.
And these scams are so lucrative because you can tie that money into pretty much a little bit of work and a lot of return. I mean, it's incredible what they actually are able to succeed with. They don't have to go and purchase bots on the dark web or do social media mining. They can do it, above board, right?
Right.
So in any case, these crimes are ridiculously, as I said, lucrative. They're also the fact that they're increasing. They increased 136% from December 2016 to May 2018.
Wow.
And that 136% totaled about $12.2 billion in take.
And that's with a B.
And that's with a B.
Yeah. So this is something we all have to take seriously.
Yes.
Now, I know that one of the things you've done to help with this is to build a data privacy guide. And how is that something that organizations can use to help them avoid being one of the ones taken in this kind of an environment?
So the last revision of the NIST 800-53 Rev 5.
That's the risk management framework.
Right.
Yep.
That one, essentially, that allowed for some security controls to be put into, or recommendations to be put into networks to consider, start to consider data privacy, right? But the idea of those security controls also not only looking at information systems, but dropping the word information and just including systems.
Okay.
That's a lot better approach because we're now thinking about not just your network, your work network, but all of the devices in which you connect to that network, right? And policies as it relate to your phone, your tablets, your laptops. The idea of agreeing to maybe a little bit more sophisticated user monitoring policy, the access policies, just largely lots of things learned from breaches and taking these security controls and sort of upping the ante to understand where they should be implemented and with what corresponding policy. So that's one of the ways in which it's being addressed, and it's going to take a long time for those policies and those recommendations to be implemented. Largely, though, most organizations have some impact on this, right? They've done some work, so hopefully this is just another iteration. The problem with these particular types of compromises and the way in which this isn't going to decrease is because larger companies, organizations, are putting these controls in place and building on what they already had, the incremental change, they're now hitting small to medium businesses. And
they don't have the money. They don't necessarily even have a network analyst.
Right.
So they don't necessarily have the structures in place to protect themselves.
Right. And they're operating, lean and mean,
Sure.
right? So they don't want to spend a lot of money on this. So what they're doing is, maybe they're using Office 365, and they don't have somebody who, maybe their administrative assistant is the same person who processes invoices, right? So they're hitting them because money is money. They don't
care where it comes from.
They don't care where it comes from.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of so there is still use for the dark web in that there's even these convenient, credential stuffing applications and they can even compare that list to, say, the Forbes top 100 CEOs, right? And they can tailor their searches so that they can find who are the best targets, and maybe they'll eliminate the top 50 because they know those companies already had a breach. Right? So let's move on down, right? Maybe our take won't be as much, but maybe we can do more and get the same amount, again.
In aggregate, yeah.
In aggregate, right. And again, these are lucrative, right? They pretty much, the scam and the work that you turn in yields all that money that gets wired out, they keep it, right? So it's you give a little to your criminal ring, you give a little to your money mule organization that actually picks up the money, but most of that money they get to keep. So you take a criminal ring of about 30 individuals and 3.2 million, that's a lot among those guys, right? That's a nice pot of cash I think they can do some work with, or maybe they use it to buy their next tool, or it's amazing to learn how sophisticated these rings are getting, right? We have people here going to graduate school, they're spending 2 years of their lives to get a degree. These guys can get up to speed in about 3-4 months and really create some amazing attacks.
So there's the organizational aspect of it,
Right.
and then there's the personal aspect of it.
Right.
Right. So I'll just using myself as an example. One of the things I've become very conscious of, and our IT shop does a great job of filtering. When we first started with email clients where we were trying to protect ourselves, I was probably putting 30% of my mail was going into the junk folder. Now I would say maybe 3-4 emails a week is all I have to deal with, individually.
Yeah.
And I do things like, check the actual email address. I got one recently that says, this is American Express, call us about your account, blah, 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 blah. And then, and the address is some weird email address that has nothing to do with American Express. So that's a really easy one to pick up on. And if somebody sends me something where they're asking for anything that is private information or semi-public information, that I'll check on it. I'll go to we have an email alias called Suspicious, which I love that name.
Yep.
Check with them. Is this something you've seen? Should I pay attention to this? Every once in a while, it's somebody for real, and I do have to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So there's productivity loss. I agree with that, but the volume isn't that high. But what are some of the other things that people should just on a routine basis, be doing just to make sure that you don't get caught in one of these scams? Because I knew it was out there, but this is news to me too, that this is such a big deal in the business world.
Well, that's again a really good question, because and I keep saying this, but it's amazing the companies that are falling for these things and the amounts of money that are again they're
involved.
Yeah. So I'd like to address that in 2 parts, because there's the one of the things that always bothers me is the empathy part that you have for the people that, fall into these traps, get hit with these scams and they're successful. So what I always look at that as the motivation for how do we empower these users. Again, don't make them the last line of defense, but if you are going to make them the last line of defense, give them tools in which they can use to prevent it from happening. So I'll talk about both sides of that. The first part is what can the companies and organizations do? Well, obviously, patching, that's always huge. So applying the software patches, looking at the vendor bulletins,
staying up to date.
But believe it or not, there's a lot of things you could do just with the tools that you already have. So Office 365 right now has been recently hit with these issues. The link in the email that said, hey, your account was flagged, click here, we're going to have to close that account, and then click here in which to recreate and sign in again so they get your credentials. So, there's finding out that Microsoft is now creating ways in which to prevent that and happening is what I'm talking about with regard to the vendor bulletins. One of the companies that I was working with on another project, because the spear phishing was so bad, the campaigns, that's what the SOC was dealing with. So there were 4 people in that security operations center, and all 4 of them told me, we're dealing with the most aren't the viruses, isn't the malware or the ransomware, it's the spear phishing campaigns. And the spear phishing campaigns are obviously connected to what these attacks are. And the idea that to thwart them, because this was a really very rich company in an industry that was pretty important and scary, won't say the name, but they actually created an affordance for the user to say, hey, I think this is spear phishing, so they could click on a button in their email client and report it, right? So empower your users rather than
make it easy for them instead of hard for them.
Make it easy for them. So, and in fact, if it was a true spear phishing campaign that was sweeping through the company, not only could they have early detection, especially if one of the network appliances didn't pick up on it, but they would then reward that specific user who reported it first,
Okay.
there was a $5,000 incentive.
Oh, wow.
They would
okay.
get paid $5,000
Okay, all
for
right.
identifying this campaign, which tells you a little bit about the revenue of that company,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But the idea is,
So that makes people more vigilant.
right, and aware. And proactive.
Right.
There's other things, so that's a UI affordances. There's also other things you could do with UI. You could color code all of your internal mail versus your external mail. You could have rules that say, maybe a Cyrillic font has been used in which to put the domain apple.com, but instead of Apple, it's AQQLE, and they specifically use a different font so that it looks like it's APPLE. Make sure that those rules for, undefined characters,
Right.
or this isn't a real domain, or the idea of this is email you've never gotten from this user before ever.
Right.
Make sure that it's legit. All of these things are
So create warnings for the user.
yes, but also make them simple. I mean, there is a lot of. There's a whole area here. Scilab, Lori Craner, working in the areas of privacy, security, and usability. We really need to emphasize addressing ways in which users can easily be proactive
Right.
about this instead of falling for these campaigns. I would also add that not just the color coding, but there are tools out there. You can use DMARC, you can use SWIF, you can. There's a lot of things that are already on the way to really addressing these types of risks, but they're not necessarily implemented yet.
Sure.
So it's going that way, but we're always playing catch up, right?
Yeah.
We're always finding ways in which to respond, and we really need to, on that spectrum, we need to move to the proactive instead of the response.
Right.
By creating ways for people to be more aware and able to take action.
So I think this is a great podcast for people to build awareness, especially people like me that had no idea how big this was. I knew it happened,
Yeah.
but the size of it is something that I think a lot of us, unless we are in one of those companies, we're not going to hear until long after the fact about how much money is involved in all these things.
Yeah.
So so taking that, how do we become more proactive? What is the direction of the research that you're working in to kind of help us to deal with these kinds of compromises in a more proactive way?
So a lot of this information stems from some really good training that myself and Larry Rogers and John Dayton did we helped to build training. The FBI was our sponsor on creating, ways to address your standard cybersecurity crimes, right? So there was a level 1 training that was around digital harassment, online fraud, identity theft, child enticement. So we created courses for law enforcement to know how to address these types of crimes. Now, the FBI sponsored it, but they really wanted it to be for the 750,000 sworn police officers out there.
Right.
Because those, and by level 1, I mean where the person is the target. So that was great training. It's still being used. And what we did then, we were moving to level 2, and that particular training, the goal there was to talk about business email compromise, talk about more at the network level rather than the individual level.
Sure.
So it was the plan. We didn't get to do all of them yet. Hopefully that'll change. But so the plan was to teach first business email compromise, and that was picked by the FBI because it was becoming such a common threat. And then, ransomware was on the rise, but it hadn't, toppled BEC yet.
Right.
So we were moving in that direction to create this training. But what I found so interesting was not just teaching law enforcement on how to deal with these crimes and how to investigate them and identify, the subject that was actually conducting them, but it was also then my perspective was how do we handle and empower and basically give tools to the individual that's being attacked. I had a lot of empathy interviewing both the investigators on these cases and then in some instances actually talking to the users. That's the thing that I really tried to drive home working with students, working with coworkers, understanding that the colleagues might not have this this view into what has happened with this particular attack, but the idea of, there is a victim, and that victim isn't just the company, the victim is the user. And this has enormous impact. This impact, not just because of the privacy breaches, say, with Equifax or with,
OPM.
There's a lot there. In 2018, they just keep climbing, right? There's more and more. Marriott. I got hit with the Target one years ago. I got hit with Marriott just last year, and credit cards are useless. Credit card numbers, right? And basically the credit card companies have fought back, right? They'll call you. I was in San Francisco for RSA, and I couldn't check into my hotel for about 2 hours because I had made a couple purchases, and my credit card company called me and said, "Are you traveling?" And we're not going to release this until you confirm.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I want to go to sleep. I'm in the hotel, but I'm glad. Right?
Yeah.
And so credit card companies have caught up, but they don't want your credit card number so much. Now they want your credentials. And why they want your credentials is because you might use that for your bank, you might use that at work, you might use that for your social media accounts. We have to make sure that users are aware how risky that is. Use different passwords or use a password manager in order to prevent that. Yeah. And prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
But when talking to the individuals that are, at the tip of the spear with regard to these attacks, they're not aware of this, right? And the impact that it has. They have less confidence in their financial information and where it's being stored, right? Some of them actually, start to use the internet less. It can have even, real. The idea that you'll lose your job. The idea that, there's even been, because they're being tracked, there's even been an uptick in, suicidal thoughts kind of stuff.
Wow.
That's the part that I tend to look at because I wish to create affordances for users to be aware, not just through the organizational training and awareness, but aware more broadly.
Right.
Because, and that's getting to this data privacy survival guide, the idea that the same rules that you apply at work, you should apply in your personal life.
Yeah. But when it comes to data privacy, the questions on Facebook about, answer these 20 questions with me. I tell people that put those things up, I'll private message them and say, do you really want to do that? Because you're giving away information that somebody could use against you. Because it's not just us. It's not just us in the room anymore. And, things like I have a friend who, was posting pictures of his vacation. It's like, oh, great, you just told everybody that you're out of town.
And let's go break into your house and steal all your stuff. Yeah.
All these things that I don't like knowing these things.
Yeah. Well, my point here is that I'm guilty of all of this too, right? And it wasn't until one of those quizzes that I suddenly became worried for all the people that were getting in on this and liking it. And right away, not that you weren't being respectful of their privacy, but I felt the need to respond to it publicly as well, because then you might reach all the people that are paying attention as well as the private messaging, right? So I say do both.
Okay.
You're not trying. I don't think my intent is to not embarrass those individuals, but it's more like a PSA saying, hey guys, if you're tracking this, just know these are your security questions, and you don't want to do this.
Yeah.
Think about these things before you might respond and or even forward, right? And maybe even just that not only gets them thinking about their information that they have on Facebook or their engagement, but then it hopefully spreads to the other social media platforms that they're on, as well as think about that at work too, right? So you're basically making it pervasive. So the idea of the 3 Ps. Pervasive, whether it's permanent, and whether it's persistent, right? So the idea is you call their attention to it, and that hopefully becomes something that isn't persistent, right? You're going to stop and thwart that from happening. You're going to see how pervasive it is, and that you'll see that, oh wow, I really am using those same credentials, and I'm using behavior here that I wouldn't use here. I mean, in many ways, I think it is important to understand social media is not, it's your digital self, it's not your personal self. So the same things that apply to you at work, almost all those same rules should apply to you on your social media. Right. The idea that one of the ways in which these attackers conduct the BEC is they'll use PIPL, so that's PIPL. That service tells information about you, pretty frightening, where you lived, who your connections are, family, previous addresses. It also tells you all the social media applications that you're using, right? So say they do have your credentials, your work credentials. They could then try that same technique on any of the other social media platforms that you're on. And again, the idea that our data is out there, that it's compromised, that it's been aggregated and available on, not just the dark web, by the way. There are publicly available data sets out there. OkCupid. It's unbelievable how many of the dating sites have been hacked, right? I mean, you have your Ashley Madison. I mean, there's 400 million users across those different dating applications. Their credentials could potentially be out there. Their accounts have been compromised. So we're talking about a lot of people. If you compare that data set with, say, a breach of some company, you're going to find some correlations. Yeah. So it's really, and the idea, again, I want to plug some work from here at Carnegie Mellon. Professor LaTanya Sweeney, she did a remarkable and wonderful amount of work with K-anonymity, and because of her PhD research and when she was working on her thesis, she was able to identify an individual based on health records and voter registration logs. And she, in comparing all the fields that were available from those two sets of data, she was able to figure out that you only need date of birth, gender, and zip code, and you can pretty much identify anybody. Wow. Just those three fields. And typically there's about 18 that you enter on any, web app, any form. And the idea that all of these records are now digitized, they're not necessarily on paper somewhere, right? They're available, and if that hospital, like Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, was held, they had a ransomware attack, right? They were held hostage for a week, couldn't take patients. The idea that those records were compromised, right? Yeah. You go after a group of people that would go to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, and then you start looking at the social media accounts of the individuals in that zip code. Again, you might find some really wealthy material, right? And
lucrative
contact,
targets.
right? And kind of tying this back all into BEC, I'm hoping to make it very clear that the contrast between the criteria of, say, a flight from Lagos, Nigeria, to Houston, Texas, was the criteria then, and the companies that were selected based on...
Which is kind of feeling really random.
Right, it is. And then now you look at so a lot of the methods are the same, right? They're consistent. What's happening is their research, their criteria. They were already working with these existing money mule organizations, but so that really hasn't changed. The method of picking up the money and getting it back to the ring, that isn't different. What is different is how they're selecting their targets, the multiple ways in which they're able to get access to the information, both publicly available and dark web social media mining, and the idea that indeed they're really getting good at it. I mean, they're on top of these vendor bulletins. They know that Office 365 had a vulnerability, right? I mean, they've gotten up to speed remarkably fast, and that's what we're dealing with. And it's not... mainly, I really want to emphasize the idea of our data is out there, it's available, and we need to dial it back, make use of the security
I've got a bunch of things
preferences,
going in my head
yeah.
right now. List of things in my head. It's like, oh, I need to fix this. I need to fix this. Which is what you want,
Yes.
right? You want all of our listeners,
Yes.
to dial it. I think dialing it back is
Right.
actually one of the messages. If
Right.
if you think that you can't be compromised, you're wrong.
Right.
And so think about what you do and how much
Absolutely.
risk you're willing to take. And that's, I think, the lure of all these applications that let us share and let us do things. I love a lot of the social media stuff. I have nieces and nephews that I don't get to visit very often, and I get to keep up with them, and I love that. I love seeing my nephew at a swim meet and things like that. But I have to think about, by engaging with that, I get into all these other things on the periphery, and they're not as innocent.
Right.
And there are people out there that will use my data if I let them.
Yep.
And so this is really, it's the 2019 version of caveat emptor, right? Beware of not just what you're buying, but what you're giving.
Right.
Is really what I'm hearing.
You're
from
giving access to yourself, and you're increasing your chances of being being a victim.
Okay, well, on that wonderful positive note, so this is some of our podcasts like this are very cautionary, and this is one of them.
Yeah.
Don't become a victim.
Yeah.
Do your own due diligence. Even if your company doesn't happen to be the ones that's very proactive, you can be proactive yourself.
Yes.
And you've got the blog post that you just put up. We've got the data privacy guide. That's not just for companies to read. Individuals can use that as well. So we're trying to make these kind of resources available to people.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for your work in this area. And I really want to thank you for being sympathetic to those. They are victims, the users that I can just imagine the woman or man who did the $3.2 million wire transfer and then found out that it was a fake. That I would be devastated. And
that's exactly the word she used.
And it wasn't intentional. It wasn't her fault. But but we have to protect against that in the future. We have to and we have to make it less lucrative for these. In my mind, all of the cybercrime, the theme for me is make them have to work harder for it.
Yeah.
There's a point at which if they have to work too hard for it, they're going to say it's not worth it.
Well,
and so that's what we have to do.
What I would say, you're summing this up incredibly well, but the idea is there's still a user at the end of this, right? Yeah. And the idea that their privacy has been invaded in order to conduct these scams, it makes their physical self feel vulnerable as well. And truly, the idea that I want to come across is empower your users. Don't make them the last line of defense. But if you do, make sure that they have affordances in which to fight back, and essentially inform them of the idea that your data is out there. Don't let it be used against you. Up that level of awareness and give them sort of a rule to go by. Right? Because we don't have the cognitive load to keep every single company breach in our heads. Yeah. But if you give them practices, best practices to prevent this from happening to you and protect yourself, that'll work.
Yeah.
But let's be reasonable here. It's not going to be memorizing NIST 800-53 Rev 5,
exactly.
Right? It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us today, and I hope that our viewers will look at some of the resources that we will post along with this, with a transcript when we post this. As always, we thank you for listening and look forward to people protecting their data.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu.